Well, welcome and good morning to everyone this morning. For those of you who know me, you know that I enjoy a challenge. And I enjoy challenges. And sometimes, though, I've learned over the years that I'm not as good as how I envision myself at accomplishing some of these challenges. Sometimes, we make mistakes like that, but I have to be man enough to admit it. This summer we were on vacation, and we were driving to, we were going up to a cottage for a couple days with my wife's family. And as we were on the way up, the kids somehow heard of this push-up challenge, 300 push-ups in an hour. I was like, that's easy. I don't know, I thought it was easy. I was like, 2 push-ups every minute, I don't know, that doesn't seem that hard. And I remember when I was younger, well, this just occurred to me as I was thinking of this example. I can remember doing 45 push-ups. I had to get ready for the police test. And, it didn't seem that hard. You just as many as you can, as quick, they time you. And I remember doing that. And then I recall, that was when I was 18 years old. That was over 30 years ago. I thought, wait a minute, this isn't very responsible of me to think that I could do this. Well, my brother-in-laws and myself, I told them about it. And of course, there's a number of us said, okay, let's try it. So we tried it. And I thought I was doing okay until, someone said, no, that's not proper form. You got to do this. And it got a little more difficult to accomplish. And then after I got maybe up to about 50 within 20 minutes or half an hour, I was like, I'm done. There's no way I'm going to hit 300. And even if I could, it's not worth the stress on my body, and I'm done. So, of course, I don't think I'll ever hear the end of it from my family, because they were like, there's no way you can do that. And they were right. So in front of everyone, I admit I was wrong. Okay. Anyways, I bring that up just to get us to think about something. I want you to think about challenges. Physically, we think of challenges. And we think of challenges maybe in our work or at home. But what about spiritually? When's the last time you've challenged yourself or challenged someone else spiritually? And we don't really do that because sometimes I think spiritually we think like I did physically. We think, oh, I've read that before. Oh yeah, I've done that before. I'm good at forgiving because I forgave someone 7 times 7 10 years ago. And then you realize, oh, that was 30 years ago. I haven't forgiven someone that much anymore. We can slowly lose that spiritual strength over time. And if you're not careful, you can assume, I've done that, I've read that, I've been there. And then we can kind of lose it and become stale in our faith. And so this morning, we're going to look at a story of a couple of guys in the Bible that maybe one of them was challenged a little bit in their faith, or both of them were for sure. And this is a story it's the shortest book in the New Testament. And I'm not sure that we really read it that often and really kind of, look into it. We're looking at the book of Philemon. Mike introduced us to it last week. He did a good job of introducing us a little bit to Philemon and the circumstances that Paul had in reaching them. Paul is in prison and he's writing a letter to the church in Colossae. And you have that letter. It's called Colossians in your Bible. It's a letter. And so as he writes this letter, he sends the letter, but he also writes another letter, and he sends it with that letter. And this is a personal letter. And he gives it to, Onesimus, which is a runaway slave, and he ran away from Philemon, and this is who the letter is to. If you have your Bible open, you'll see there's a book in your Bible called Philemon. And we don't give it chapters and verses because it's so small. It's just one chapter. So if you ever here we say turn to Philemon 27, you're like, Philemon chapter 27. No, there's one chapter. And it's just a short letter. But it's rich. It's rich with knowledge. It's rich with information. And it's rich in helping us learn to grow in our faith. And so we can often overlook it. It's like, how are you going to have a Bible study in Philemon? I mean, we're only doing a 2-week sermon on it. But there's so much in the text. And we want to go there this morning. Now, on the surface, it's really deep, because Philemon, he's a wealthy Christian. And we know he's wealthy because the church is meeting in his home. He's got a home big enough for the church to meet in. And not only that, but he has slaves. He's a slave owner. Now, this is a difficult topic. I'm not going to dive into the topic of slavery in the Bible this morning, just for time's sake. We can do that another time. But I will just touch on it. And I will say, when we hear the word slavery, often, we have a picture in our mind of what that looks like. But I just want to say, when it comes to the topic of slavery, there's a lot of variables. Slavery under what system? What social construct? What time in history? Under, what society? I mean, the Egyptians had slavery 2000, BC or 1500 BC in the Bible. We read about that. And then you read about the slavery that's happening during the time of Philemon, which is under the Romans. Different laws, different rules. And then, we read of slavery in the Bible. And, of course, we see Hebrew slavery. And, again, there's so many variables. There's different ways we look at the word. There's different, again, social constructs in the context. Sometimes people could become voluntary slaves if they wanted to acquire something or pay off a debt. And so sometimes in some societies, slavery was more connected to maybe like a sports team, where you are traded and owned by a sports team, but you still have your freedom, but you have this ownership in that sense. So it just depends. There's so many variables. I'm not going to get into that right now. But we will just say this is under the Roman system. And under the Roman system, Philemon, as a slave owner, he had a lot of rights. He was wealthy. He's probably looked at a little different than most people in society. There were a lot of slaves under the Roman system. I think over 50% of the people were slaves. And Philemon had a number of slaves. And Philemon was a wealthy, well-to-do, and it seemed like he was a good, honest Christian. But when we say he was a good, honest Christian, I mean, he probably thinks he is. He's doing pretty good. He's wealthy. Paul will write to him. He's heard about his faith. He's got the church meeting in his home. He's a giver. But not everybody likes Philemon, I don't think. Because this slave of his, Onesimus, he has had a bad experience, and he runs away. Not only does he run away, it seems like he's taken something. And maybe he stole something from Philemon. Maybe he's felt like he's owed something and he takes it. We don't know. Onesimus probably made some bad decisions on his own. Maybe that's what landed him as a slave in the first place. We don't know a whole lot of backstory amongst these two individuals. But what we do know is both of them became Christians. So how do you act now in the Roman society as a Christian slave owner or as a Christian slave? And that's what this book has to say to us. Now, again, we might say, well, we don't have slavery, so it doesn't say anything to us. When you think about the situation, though, maybe you are an employee or you're indebted and you can't walk away from your job. You can't because you owe too much money, or maybe you've, put yourself in a situation. It could even be something as simple as Jacob, who, indebts himself 7 years of work for Rachel. And so whatever the situation you find yourself, you may find yourself as an employer, employee. You might feel like a slave. You might feel like, you've got freedom. And by the way, freedom is a whole other word, is what freedom means and what ownership means and how you look at that. So let's just dive into Philemon here this morning. And first we want to take a look at the situation. There's a runaway slave, Onesimus. Okay, Onesimus ran away. Now, he somehow bumps into Paul in Rome. I don't think that Onesimus, was like, I got to find money. I'm going to go panhandle on the streets. I'm going to door knock and see if people have money. And he door knocks and, oh, Paul, I didn't know you were here. This is not random. He specifically sought out Paul. And when he found Paul, it seems like Onesimus became a Christian. So it seems like he wasn't a Christian before he met Paul. And he goes to seek Paul out. Well, why would he seek Paul out? How would he even get to Rome? I mean, he's in Colossae. Rome's no short distance from Colossae. And so he ends up finding Paul, becoming a Christian, and then he ends up being sent back to his master. Now, under the Roman system, if you're a slave and you ran away, you thought life was bad as a slave. Life was going to be much worse as a runaway returned slave. Not only could you be beaten, you could severely punished, and not only that, maybe killed for your crime. especially if he's stolen something. The last thing Onesimus wants to do is go back. Now, I want you to picture, you finally gained your freedom by running away. Maybe you stole some money. And he's obviously had enough money to get to Rome. That's, again, no small feat. So he's there. Where are you going to go? You're on the run. If you get caught, life is over. You're scared. You're on the run. You've got this weight of guilt. This is Onesimus. But remember, he was a slave in the house of a Christian, of a house whose home was being used for worship services. And don't think that he wasn't listening in during some of those church lessons and sermon series and whatever else they were doing. Don't think that he wasn't there listening. I'm sure he was, and he probably heard of Jesus. Jesus going to, with the tax collectors and the sinners and the downtrodden. Jesus was there for those people at the bottom. Onesimus probably needs Jesus, but where's Jesus? He's dead. So where do you find Jesus? Through his people. And maybe he didn't see Jesus the way that he wanted to see Jesus through Philemon or some of the church in Colossae, but he certainly saw Jesus in Paul, and I believe that's what brought him to find Paul. He had probably heard of Paul, seen Paul, met Paul, and so he goes to see Paul and to ask for some advice. What do you do when you're at your lowest? And so let's see how Paul teaches Philemon. Okay. First thing, we can read the book of Philemon, and you see that, there's a bunch of things that kind of jump out as you're reading the book, and you're kind of like, okay, he must have talked about this. He must have talked about this. So, for example, Paul sends Philemon back. Here's a letter. Go back to your master. What? Yep. Well, he could kill me. Yep. And so Paul's telling him to do the right thing no matter what the circumstances, no matter how it's going to turn out. You still have an obligation to do what's right. You don't want to live with guilt. You don't want to live being on the run. I mean, there's people that go all their lives, they have the most serious and terrible sins that they're hiding, and they're living with that. And how much freedom you have by confessing your sin, getting it out there, making things right, making wrongs right. Those are biblical principles Paul probably talked to Onesimus about. Those are biblical principles we see in Scripture. Jesus says, when you give, don't let your right hand see what your left hand is doing. There's a principle there. When when someone wants to dig up dirt on the Christian, they come up and they say, hey, someone wanted to dig up dirt on you, and they said, church, look at all the dirt we have on so-and-so. And the church responds, yeah, we know. Yeah, they confessed that to us. Yeah, they were sorry for that sin, and we prayed for them, and they've been working on it. What? And when they're trying to dig up dirt, it's not they don't just find the dirt on you. They find all this good stuff. Because why? Because you've been hiding the good that you're doing. And they're not just pulling dirt on you, they're pulling up good stuff, and they can't find that much dirt, and they find nothing that hasn't been revealed. That's how the idea, the principle behind how a Christian lives. You make wrongs right. Jesus even says that when you're going to worship, if someone's got something against you, we read this in Matthew chapter 5, 23 through 26. If you're presenting your sacrifice at the altar in the temple and you suddenly remember someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice and go and be reconciled to that person. Make those wrongs right. Now, you can't always do this. Someone might say, I don't want to talk, get out of here. But at least you can try. If you've tried, you've done your job. If you don't even try, Jesus would say, try to make your wrongs right. Coming to God and pretending you have no wrongs and pretending you haven't hurt people is a wrong attitude. And it's not always easy. Sometimes you will end up in trouble. I can remember I was waiting for a bus. I was a student, and I was waiting for a bus. It was in Toronto. And the owner had this car, and I remember this car was a Cutlass Supreme. And the Cutlass Supreme in the 80s, it had these grills that, they only had 2 screws at the top, and they had a little bit of flex to them. I thought it was on a spring. And so I said to my friend, because I had seen another Cutlass, and I said, hey, that's cool. And I said to my friend, these cars, they have springs right at the front on the front grill. Maybe it's something to do with, bumper detection or something. I don't know. And I said, look at this. And I pushed it in. Well, I didn't know. It didn't have springs. It was just only 2 screws at the top, nothing at the bottom. So I pushed it in there and snap, and the thing fell to the ground. This square piece. Now, it was a $20 part, now that I've learned a little bit about cars. But he didn't know. And I went to the owner, and I brought it in, and I missed my bus. I said, I'm so sorry, Bill. I broke your car by accident. I could have just left it. He would have came out and said, what happened? There's no cameras, and there's no door cams, driveway cams, or anything like that back then. I could have just left it. But instead, I showed it to him. And the response, I thought he would be proud for me telling the truth. You know, I was going to pay for it. Boy, did I pay for it. 3 months of phone bills he wasn't going to charge me for. Here's a bunch of phone bills, and here's all this other stuff. And the relationship changed from there on out. It was never again the same. Well, I don't hold that against Bill. That's human nature. Sometimes that's going to happen, and you have to be willing. That helped build my character, though. I learned that, hey, when I'm going to go do something right, sometimes it's going to hurt. But I didn't have to live. Now, if I hadn't done that, now I'd be living with. I never did tell that guy. I should have fessed up, you know, and who knows what he had to. Now I know. I paid for it, and it worked out in the end. So, making wrongs right. Doing your best in whatever circumstance. You know what? Life's not always fair. And you might feel wronged like a Philemon. Maybe your employer is taking advantage of you. Maybe someone else is taking advantage, and you've just got to make it right. I'm going to teach them a lesson. They owe me. You know, I'm never going to get that back, so I'm going to go, you know, puncture their tire or something. You know, sometimes we feel we need to get revenge or we need to get what's owed us. Paul would have told Onesimus, life's not always fair, buddy. Life's not always fair. Look at Jesus. Jesus came and he was born to this poor family, what? Under the Romans. You don't think there was ever a Roman who bullied Jesus? I mean, they took his life. You don't think that Romans, they could have asked a Jew, hey, carry this with me. Jesus said when they ask you to go a mile, what? You go 2. In other words, sometimes you're going to be abused. Sometimes you're going to be taken advantage of. But we don't focus on that and make it our goal to get revenge. We remember that we've got something better. And so if you're born into a position of slavery back then, Paul would have said, obey your human masters with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as you would Jesus. Work for them as you work for Jesus. Don't work while being watched as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, do God's will from your heart. Serve with a good attitude, as to the Lord and not people. I remember a brother reading this. And by the way, Paul would say this in Ephesians. He also writes this to the church in Colossae. The same thing he says to both churches. He says, don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but work wholeheartedly fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not people, knowing that you will receive your reward and inheritance from the Lord. Knowing you've got something better. Knowing freedom around the corner. By the way, he also goes on to say, and we're going to get there when we talked about Philemon, masters, you have a specific responsibility too. And remember that you have a master. We are all equal under God. There is no one that's greater. No one has a better position in life. You're all equal under God when it comes to our value. We might have different positions and different abilities and different gifts and different situations. But under God, we all have the same fate. And we all have the same value. So, Onesimus, work hard. Pretend you're working for the Lord. There's a reason for this. I remember a brother read this. I was in Brantford, and we were having a Bible study Wednesday night, and he had a real problem with his boss. And this verse came up, and he said, oh, I just need to pretend there's a paper bag on my boss's head that says Jesus. You know, this is Jesus under there that I'm serving. I'm like, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So, Onesimus, work hard. Onesimus, remember that you have a responsibility as a Christian to make disciples. Well, how do I do that? I'm a slave. I can't even go out of the house. You can make one amazing disciple your master, or 2. or 3, however many are in your situation. Slaves, submit to their masters in everything. Be well-pleasing. Don't talk back or steal, but demonstrate your utter faithfulness. Why? So that they may adorn the teaching of God. That they might see you and be so impressed that they want to know what makes you who you are. They want to know Jesus. And so, remember, slaves, you are wearing the robes of Jesus. How did Jesus do it? Jesus didn't even have to serve people, and he did. Jesus, it says, and we read in Mark, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life. Amen. He served so much, he gave his only life. And there he is washing the feet of the disciples when none of them want to get up and just do one simple task. Jesus does it for them to set an example. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. Slaves should regard their masters as worthy of respect so that God's name and his teaching will not be blasphemed. Let those who have believing masters not be disrespectful to them because they are brothers, but serve them even better. Let those who have believing masters not be disrespectful to them because they are brothers, but serve them even better, since those who benefit from their service are believers and dearly loved. So, Onesimus came to the right place. He got some good advice from Paul. He turned to God when he was in trouble, and he got some help. And so Paul writes in this letter to Philemon, Philemon, if you consider yourself to be a partner, a disciple, to be in koinonia, in fellowship with God, with the church, then you need to welcome him back. So this kind of limits what Philemon's able to do. He can treat him harshly, and he has his free rights, and Paul says that. We're going to read that in a minute. But Paul says, if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge it to me. Philemon, sometimes faith is about sacrifice. Now, to those of us with freedom, sometimes we give up our freedoms, we sacrifice to live out our faith. And the very one who's writing this is in prison under house arrest, Paul. He gave up his freedom. You don't think Paul wanted to be out visiting churches and going and spreading and missionary work? You don't think Paul wanted that? More than anything, that's what he was about. But he's stuck in a house under house arrest, and it's probably just really driving him crazy, but he does what he can. So he's writing letters, and he's helping train people who come to visit him. And Onesimus comes, and Paul's like, wow, here's an opportunity. And so Paul's writing to Philemon, who's free, who has slaves. And he's saying, you might have to sacrifice, Philemon. I'm sending you back this slave. But guess what? Paul's in prison. And not only that, Paul's willing to pay the price for Onesimus. Whatever he's done, charge it to me. That's what reconciliation is. To make things right. You do whatever you can under the circumstances you're in. Isn't that what Jesus did? The debt that we owe, our sin, he took it upon himself. He paid it so we could be free. Philemon, you have responsibility as well. You have a responsibility to respond properly. And so he would say, to the slaves, act properly. And then he would say to Philemon, I'm confident of your obedience. I'm writing it knowing you'll do even more than what I say. And then he says, perhaps this is why he was separated for a brief time, so that you might get him back permanently. So Paul's completely expecting him to take him back. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave. A dearly loved brother. He is especially so to me, but how much more to you both in the flesh and in the Lord. Paul goes on to say, I wanted to keep him with me. He's valuable for me, but I'm sending him back. In other words, Philemon, you have a great tool now for the Lord's ministry. Isn't our life about making disciples and spreading the good news? This young slave of yours, or this runaway slave, I don't know how old he was, this runaway slave of yours, because of all these circumstances, has become a Christian. And now you have him back as a brother. You have a Christian living in your home. So treat him differently. That doesn't mean that That Onesimus doesn't have to continue to work for him, but they're going to have a different relationship now. He's going to be treated properly. Because Philemon, being the one that was wronged, has every right to respond harshly. But Christians don't do that. Christians are kind and loving and forgiving. Christians are extremely patient. Things that we all need to be working on, especially myself. And Philemon, you have a responsibility to make disciples in the kingdom. To use your resources, your abilities, to use your servants to grow the kingdom. And as much as Paul wanted to keep him, Paul sends him back, find ways to use him for kingdom's work. And so Philemon has some responsibility. And finally, Paul says, two more. Once he was useless to you, but now he is useful to both you and me. So I am sending back my very own heart. I wanted to keep him so that in my imprisonment for the gospel, he might serve me in your place. You should be here, Philemon. But he's doing a good job. But I didn't want to do anything without your consent. So your good deed might not be out of obligation but free will. It is still your choice. And so Philemon has a choice. Finally, Paul says, if you consider me a partner, welcome him. And then he goes, I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it. He's serious. He will repay whatever's owed. But then he says, not to mention that you owe me your very self. Philemon, do you realize what you have been given? If you're going to grab this slave that comes back and treat him harshly, you need to remember the story Jesus told. The parable of the unmerciful servant. Paul's not saying that Philemon owes Paul something. He owes God his very life. And Paul was the one who brought that message to Philemon. Remember the story, Matthew 18? Now, before you read this, I'll just tell it quickly and then you can look at it. There was a man who owed 10,000 talents. Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I asked what a talent was. Remember a talent? Talent is 6,000 denarii. And one of those is a day's wages. So you can imagine 10,000 talents. So one talent is 6,000 days' wages. Okay? Brandon maybe doing some math there. I mean, this is no small amount. When you owe 10,000 talents, one talent is like, what, a 20-year work or something? I don't know. It's a long time. One talent. Like, you might be lucky in your lifetime to own a talent. 10,000 talents? That's what you owe? How do you even get that? And who has that to lend? God, the king. And he calls this man in, pay back, and the man he can't pay it back. He says, please have mercy on me. And the king says, you're forgiven all of it. Who can say that? The king can, and he does. And when this guy goes, he finds someone. We read, be patient with me. And, the master of the servant had compassion, released him, and forgave him of the loan. He went out and found someone who owed him what? 100 days' wages. 100 denarii. That's it. And it says he grabbed him and started choking him. Pay back what you owe. And this fellow servant fell down and began begging, just like he was. Be patient with me, and I'll pay you back. But he wasn't willing. Instead, he went and threw him in prison till he could pay what was owed. And the end of that story is this. Others hear about it, and they tell the king, and the king brings him back and says, you wicked servant. How can you not have forgiven someone after you've been forgiven that much? Philemon, this slave of yours who did you wrong and who ran away, he became a Christian, and that's what you live for because you have been forgiven. For we are all slaves. We are all slaves to our sin. And this is how God uses things. We talk about family. God teaches us about relationship. Talk about children. God teaches us about our connection with God. And he uses situations of the time like slavery. And God is trying to get us to see that we are all slaves of sin. Some of us see it clearly. There's some sins in our life. We don't want to do it. and it's just got a hold of us, and we give in, and we feel sick, and we feel bad, and we're like, tomorrow I'm not doing that. And then we do the same thing the next day. Why do I do this? We are a slave to what owns us. Sin. But Jesus came to set us free. We have been freed from that. We have been forgiven. And when we continually sin and we're sorry, we're trying not to, he doesn't remember. It's blotted out. Our sin is already forgiven. When you come here this morning and you look up and we meet around the Lord's Supper and we remember his sacrifice and we're like, Lord, I sinned just a couple hours ago. I can't believe it. I need your forgiveness. It's already covered. It's gone. When we commit our lives to the Lord, we've accepted his sacrifice. Our sin is blotted out. It's like that whiteout on a paper. Well, we don't use whiteout anymore. It's like the delete key and erase forever, and the hard drive's been destroyed permanently. I mean, it's gone. God's not going to be like, hey, you owe this. It is gone. It's deleted. It's not counted against us. He himself gave himself to redeem us from all lawlessness and to cleanse us for himself, a people for his own possession, to do good works. He has purchased us as his slaves, as his servants. And again, when you think of being a servant of God, that is a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful situation. Context means everything. Were you called while a slave? Don't let it concern you, but if you can gain your freedom, by all means take the opportunity, Paul says. He who is called by the Lord as a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who is called as a free man is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of people. We are to be workers for the Lord, for good works, to glorify him and to bring others to him. Paul says, although I am free and am not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. Submit as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as God's slaves, as his servants. Honor everyone. Love the brothers and sisters, the church. Fear God. And so God is using this story of Philemon and Onesimus to get us to recognize that we are all valued equally under God. We are all to answer to God. And he is a good God. But masters have a master, and every slave will find themselves free. And while we're here, we do the best with our freedom and with our time to honor God. And so what can we learn from Philemon and Onesimus? Remember confession. Remember forgiveness. Remember kindness, love, and patience, mercy. Remember honesty. Remember to turn to God when you're in trouble. Whether it's reading his word and prayer, God will help you. And Philemon maybe thought, we think about testing our faith, growing and challenging ourselves, no pain, no gain. Sometimes we need to challenge ourselves continually to grow. And sometimes we might think that we're at a place when really we still have room to grow. Growing hurts, but never give up. And finally, the future is glorious. Focus on the future as we do our best with the time and abilities God has given us to serve him in whatever capacity we find ourselves in our lives. Let's stand as we sing our final hymn.